first of all, I mean, thank you to you, Dr. Miller and Dr. Lampert, for both agreeing to do this debate on technology. So like all the previous debates, we're going to have Dr. Miller and Dr. Lampert both give an introduction on their position, and then give each of them the opportunity to respond to each other. And then following that, maybe about 30 or 40 minutes of them discussing it, we're going to open it up to questions from anybody in the audience. So I believe Dr. Lampert is going to be beginning with his opening statement.
Sure. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me. It's nice to be here. Hello to all of you. Okay, so I'm not going to argue that technology is always good in all cases. That would be unreasonable, and I'm sure Dr. Miller is not going to argue that it's always bad in all cases. So we'll meet somewhere in the middle probably, but I also don't want to just take the bland position that technology is neutral and that it's good if you use it well and bad if you use it poorly. I want to take a stronger position that at least some controversial forms of technology are good, recognizing that there are always dangers and risks with any technology, so not being naive about it. But three kinds of technology I'm going to argue for, even though they're controversial. I think some kinds of technology are always bad. Gas chambers, I can't think of a good use. And some kinds of technology are kind of always good, like refrigerators. Um, but keeping in mind that even a good technology could be misused. The technology can always predict how it's going to be used. You could hide a dead body in there. But anyways, I'm going on the usual intended use of a technology, um, as that's what I'll focus on. So I do want to define technology first, because I don't want the term technology, in my view, to be too broad. Of course, how you use a term is always going to be just up to you, but I prefer a narrower use of the term so that I don't want to include tools as technological devices, like a stick that pulls an apple down from a tree. Animals use those, humans use those. They're tools. They're perfectly good, but I don't want to call that a technology, and I don't want to call it technology when you use your own body to do something, even though there are techniques that allow you to use your body better. But I don't want to call so because technological device, I'm gonna anything that counts as technology has an internal engine or power source. So it may not drive itself completely. It might need a human activator. But I think like a car has an engine inside. Different kinds of technological devices have different kinds of internal engines that are trickier. So a program, it's not really a power source, but when you feed information into a computer with a program, the program will do something to that information, create a different kind of output. Chemical technology, again, or genetic technology is different again. It's not really an engine, but when you put some genetic material into a body, then under certain conditions, the body will do something to cells. So it's in a broad sense, but it actually has something as the work, so that the user doesn't do all the work on it. Of course, the second part is if there's an internal engine, the piece of technology has to have a set of tubes or mechanisms or something to bring the energy out to the surface of the machine. And then the surface has to be able to pick up something or do something to something outside of the machine. So if it's a robot arm in a factory, the machine will grab onto a screw and stick it onto something and screw it in. If it's a car, the engine will drive the wheels will grasp the ground won't change, but the car will move because it's grasping the ground. So anyways, it's got a series of mechanisms to bring the energy to the outside and do something. And the third thing I think that's involved in technology is that it does have a user, and that the user is affected by using it. And the consequence is that it's always possible, even likely, that the user will be changed by using the technology. Maybe changed in the way they think, changed in the way they uh, in the way their body works, change in the way they live, or change in the kind of society they live in. And of course, it's because of that that people are sometimes reluctant to be entirely in favor of technology, because it can affect human nature. And so this is going to be my basic principle for siding with technology, the principle on this topic. So my principle is My principle is that it's possible to change nature and that it's sometimes good to change human nature. That human nature does, in fact, change. And then the next point is that if it's possible to change human nature and it's sometimes good, then it makes sense that we might as well control our own decisions about how to change it. Rather than leaving the change to chance, we should take control of our capacity to change human nature. So that's the principle why technology is good, because it'll help us change human nature. So you might not all agree with that, but that's going to be my principle. And so in that context, I'm going to defend three cases of technology that not everybody agrees with. The first, space travel. I'm very, very strongly in favor of space travel, and to my mind, one of the true scandals of human civilization is that in 1969, the human species figured out a way to get off the planet and onto the moon. It surely is one of the biggest things that humans have ever done to get off the planet and start exploring the cosmos, the whole cosmos. We started to see the whole cosmos. There were six human manned space missions to the moon. And in 1972, after the sixth one, the human species decided, why bother? The cosmos opened up to humanity. And 3 years later, we all decided it's not worth it. Let's not look anymore. To me, if there's a bad sign for what's wrong with humans, that's it. And so my goal is to redress the scandal of 1972 and start exploring the universe again. The world is out there to look at it. So this is my command. My command is go and look. Don't just close your eyes. The world is out there. To not want to do space travel is like the most interesting thing in the world is right in front of you. And you, no, I don't want to look at that. But that's absurd. So that's my first rule. Go and look and go. And of course, it is true that as we start exploring other planets and start to go live there, the other planets are going to have different environments, and our bodies are not going to suit that very well. And so I think we do have to keep in mind that when we go to other planets for longer than a few hours at a time, we're going to have to evolve to fit those other forms of environment. So that's an implication, and I think we should go along with it. We're going to have to change our bodies and probably change our minds, maybe change our social structures, but we'll be living on the rest of the world. To not do that, to not go and evolve on other places, it would be as if the apes never evolved into humans. As if the apes decided, let's just not evolve. Imagine that. So I think it's just painfully obvious. We should look, we should go, we should evolve to fit the places that there are in the universe. I do want to not be naive about it. There is dangers with going into space, and the biggest danger, to my mind, is the chance that the space will be militarized. There's obviously going to be capitalism in space as well, and we don't know how that's going to go. So I don't want to minimize the dangers and the risks and the bad side, but I do think that it's time to go. Okay, the second aspect of technology that I'm going to recommend is the genetic modification of humans. So, of course, this is controversial as well. But I think it's starting to be possible. I don't want to quite make the argument that since it's possible, then we must do it. But this is a route we can see, and I think it's time to start seizing the possibilities in it. Not just for curing small diseases, but to really see what is possible for humans, to start imagining ourselves. So if space travel is about looking, genetic modification is about imagining. So I want to start this with the scandal of evolution, of natural evolution. And so the first thing I want to say is that natural evolution is not doing a good job. And the case study that I'm going to give you is this case study of a turtle eating. So I don't know if you've ever been at a zoo and seen a large tortoise eating, Have you ever seen that? So they give a huge amount of vegetation material and put it into the tortoise's cage. This is one of these tortoises is like 6 feet around. And the tortoise puts its head up to where the vegetation is, and it like manages to get a bunch of it into its mouth, and then it kind of clumps like this for a while. And most of the vegetation just kind of falls out the side. And some of it by chance into its throat. And the turtle just sits there hour after hour, just kind of going like this until enough gets into its throat that it doesn't die. That's my view of what evolution does. Evolution gets a species to the point where they don't all die. That's what survival of the fittest means. Survival of the fittest means you get individuals of the species that live long enough to procreate. It doesn't mean great members of the species arise. In fact, evolution is really not very good at creating top-notch, state-of-the-art animals. It just doesn't do that. It's just good enough to survive. And so for me, for my own personal taste, just good enough is not good enough. Just waiting for natural evolution to affect humans is not of interest. Okay, so I think in this case, imagine is the desideratum, and that it's time to grow up. It's time to grow up and take control of our growth. If you don't take control of the growth, then the next generation is going to be pretty much the same as this generation. Okay, it's not exactly the same, but it might as well be. Because as far as we can tell, you're just going to pass down your genes. You might as well clone. Having natural babies more or less like cloning with a few mutations. Okay, I think it's time to make use of mutation as a possibility. And here's some of the things I would like to do. I'd like to go try living in the water, but I'm going to need a different body for that. Okay, there's a bunch of things I was going to say, but on the case of genetic modification, I do think that our science is way behind. We're not getting very far. It's going to be decades, maybe centuries before we can really control it. So I'm going to suggest in the meantime, let's use prostheses. Let's get sort of mechanical things that we hook into our organic bodies. And for that, I'll tell you some things I want. I want a third eye on the back of my head so I can see backwards. I want an extra arm that I can put on and take off. And I would like to have a womb so that I can have a baby. And I'd be happy to have electrodes put directly into my brain so that I can think faster or differently. And since I like to watch movies, I'd be happy to have a kind of electrode that will go straight into my brain, and then I'll have the movie experience just out of my brain. I won't have to see it on a screen outside of me. So those are a few prostheses I like. I don't know if genetic modification of the organic body and mechanical introduction of things into the organic body are the same principle or not, but that's what I'm taking as the second sphere of good technology, manipulation of the body. And then the third is the use of AIs. So artificial intelligence, obviously a huge development in the last few years. To me, because I play the game of Go, the big thing is that Google's DeepMind was able to create a program that could defeat the best human Go player. Go is a game a little bit like chess. It's got a grid. It's much larger board. It's 19 lines by 19 as opposed to chess 8 by 8. So it was much harder to design a computer to play Go well than it was to play chess well. But surprisingly, probably decades before it was expected, Google's DeepMind team created a Go player that defeated the world's best human by quite a lot. And now there's other programs that are doing even better. The way they did it is by sampling. They did it not by analysis, not by teaching the computers logic, but by teaching the computers to statistically make use of large data sets. So I've got more things to say about how the AI works. I think AI is not really it's not really attempting to think the way humans think. It's a different procedure. And what it does is it creates out of either large samples or large imaginary samples solutions to problems like how to win at a certain game. It's good at working out how a small helicopter could fly through a windstorm. It's good for what it's going to be good for next is medical diagnosis and legal options. So there's not a lot of money in Go playing. And so the people who developed the Go program, they went into something lucrative. And most of them went into this field of medical diagnosis. There's a lot of money in that. And so pretty soon, a lot of people in pharmacy or in basic medical care are going to lose their jobs to the AIs. So this is the first thing I say is that you should know that the AIs are coming and nobody should get a career where they've got a job as going to be replaced by an AI. So what does an AI do? An AI does a job where if you know the goal and you have a procedure for getting to the goal, you can follow those steps, get to it, and then evaluate, did I reach the goal or not? Any job which is like that is a job where you're going to be replaced by an AI. Happily, you've all noticed that philosophy is not one of those. Philosophy is not a job where you have a clear goal in advance and you can decide at the end whether you've achieved it and you know what steps to follow. So although there's not much money in philosophy either, these jobs at least won't be replaced by AIs. Okay, the AI speeds you up. The AI means you're going to have to partner your brain with a device on the outside of you. And so that's what's going to happen with AI. I think we're not going to think on our own. We're going to think as a team, a human with a computer. When the best AIs started to win at chess, this was the idea of Kasparov, the great chess player who was defeated by a computer. His idea was not to just leave the game of chess to computers now, but to make teams, that a human computer team could play better chess than a computer by itself or a human by itself. So I think that's what we're going to end up doing. So partner up, speed up. Some things that we do now are going to be hobbies, like driving a car. That's not going to happen anymore, except like in special parks where you go do something old-fashioned, like putt-putt golf. Of course, the danger here is that people will become unemployed. And so my suggestion for not falling prey to the risk of AI is don't give up thinking, think with the thing. And really the thing we need to do is make technology, make programs. And so I think there's a widening gap today between the people who make programs like Twitter and the people who use them. And the people who use Twitter are getting stupider and stupider, but the people who make them are getting smarter and smarter. They're very difficult to make, and it requires long chains of reasoning. And so that's going to be a requirement for each of us to make use of AI to improve life, is that people are going to have to learn how to use those things. So the nice thing is that maybe the future will have very active people in the face of AI and GM and so on. And just the kind of the last picture that might make this feel nice is that we probably shouldn't expect that the great new technological developments are going to happen in large and powerful countries or are going to be produced by large and powerful corporations because they're committed to the current technology. I don't think we're going to see alternatives to fossil fuels come from the United States or come from Exxon because they are already making so much money out of fossil fuels. It's going to come from some other part of the world, maybe from those huge solar tile farms in Africa where there's a lot of sunlight and some open space in the Sahara and the Sahel. And so I think we might expect, and this might be good, the new technologies to come from unexpected places. And I don't want to be just naive again and make the world sound like it's going to be like a Black Panther Afrofuturism where there's a special secret world in Africa, Wakanda, and they have all the best new technology. It's not going to be that simple. There's prices to pay, but it might come from unexpected sources, and maybe that's good. So anyways, those are my three proposals: space travel, genetic modification, and AI. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Lampert. Dr. Miller, would you like to give your introduction?
I have a question. Would it be better for me to give my introductory speech or just to say a few words about Dr. Lampert's speech and then he could say a few words about my speech at the end? It occurs to me, I guess I'd like to just say a few words about his speech, about the three things while they're fresh on my mind, and then I could give my speech.
Sure.
Okay. So I just have very specific questions or objections about the three technologies that you champion. I too would like to see a lot more space travel, but I want to hear from you either now or later why it is that we should have kept going, let's say, to the moon. My impression of 1972 was there was a recognition that we'd done it primarily to show off to the Soviets, and that we didn't really learn anything when we got there. And that, yes, looking is a good idea, but that looking through telescopes, not just optical telescopes, but telescopes and more sophisticated technology are teaching us much more about the cosmos than we can learn by going places. Although, of course, it would be nice to go to Mars, but beyond that, it's not really clear what we can do. About genetics, I don't believe that evolution is always good. Obviously, it's a random process. But when it comes to the turtles, which I know nothing about, I would want to know, is there some reason why the grass is falling out of their mouths? Because oftentimes animals do things that to us look foolish, but to them make good sense. Or I wouldn't even say to them make good sense, but make good sense to a creature in that circumstance. So for example, I got chickens this summer, and they take dirt baths. They dig holes and they go into the dirt and they start covering themselves in dirt. And I just thought they were stupid. It turns out that the dirtier your feathers are, the less likely you are to get lice. So they do things that are actually quite smart in their own terms. And oftentimes they're quite surprising in that respect. When it comes to changing our genetics, I'm not against it. I don't think there's any problem with so-called playing God, except that the changes, we would have to really understand what we're doing, because so oftentimes we think tinkering with nature will go one way and it has all kinds of unintended consequences. And we're not anything close to that level, although you admitted that when you said that we should go with prostheses. I do wonder about the prostheses, like a third eye, for example. It sounds cool, like I could see things in 360 degrees, but then again, do I have a brain that's equipped to understand seeing things in 360 degrees? Again, that seems to me the kind of change that might in fact be disastrous if it were implemented simply because we don't understand enough. On the artificial intelligence, I'm going to say a lot more about artificial intelligence in my speech, but we don't disagree that much, it seems to me, about it, because you grant that artificial intelligences don't think like us. They just have very specific goals, and they work with huge data sets and statistical patterns. I do wonder, though, about this example of human and computer teams that Kasparov advances, because considering how AlphaGo works, or DeepMind, I gather, worked with Deep Blue, worked with chess, I just wonder what does a human have to offer? If they're already winning, what is it that a human could do to help the computer? Especially because, as I recall, when AlphaGo defeated Lee Sedol, it made moves that commentators just thought were stupid. They were just absurd moves. And apparently sometimes it did make terrible moves, but it also made brilliant moves that nobody ever imagined before. So it seems to me a human could inhibit the computer to get it from making stupid moves. But then again, what we think to be stupid might in the end be the winning move. So it seems to me a human would just hold the computer back. So those are the three objections. You can see maybe now why I wanted to make them right after your speech, because I'm going to talk about different things, and by the end of my speech, I may not remember. Okay, so should I enter into my speech then? Okay. All right, so I've written mine, and so I'll read it to you Oval Office style. The audacity. I'm going to try to persuade you that technology is not good on Zoom. To be sure, many other technologies have empowered us to do more good than Zoom ever will, but we must accord special status in this debate to computers and the internet, without which we wouldn't be here. They have permitted us a semblance of normal life through this pandemic. How dare I criticize them, using them themselves? Well, sometimes the revolution must use the tools of the old order, or more precisely in this instance, the counter-revolution must use the tools of the revolution. Now, to be clear, if I were looking for technologies that have been used to do the most harm in human history, I would not begin with computers and the internet. Instead, I would adduce the weapons we have devised to hurt and destroy bodies, from iron blades to nuclear warheads. Or I might turn our attention to the chemicals we have synthesized, some of which addle and addict our minds, while others destabilize the natural environment of our planet. Who can weigh the harms of such technologies, against the benefits of antibiotics, the book, the sale. I wouldn't know where to begin. Some say such accounting is easy. Which era would you choose to live in? If, like most, you would choose the present with all its technologies over the past when they were absent, you seem to have judged our technological development more good than bad. But I don't think that shows anything, unless we could survey citizens of the past to learn whether they too would choose their present, as I suspect most would. Our untutored imaginations are not reliable guides to value. The ways in which we are superior to others, past or present, loom large in our self-regard. The ways in which we are inferior often escape our notice. Besides, none of those technologies is either good or bad in its own right. It all depends on how they are used, or not used, as the case may be. This is clearest, I think, in technologies such as the following: pesticides, forged steel, the internal combustion engine. Each of these has been used to achieve immense good and immense harm, on different occasions by different people, but also by the same people on the same occasions. This ambiguity highlights a feature of all technologies. They are tools whose user does good or bad by using them. In themselves, they are neither good nor bad. A rock is neither good nor bad. You can use it to build a house, or you can use it to smash a skull. And frankly, each use might be good or bad depending on the occasion. Tools are just that neutral. So I might stop there and conclude that technology is not good, not because it is bad, but because it is neutral. Case closed. However, I'm sure that would disappoint you. You want me to argue that technology is bad. Well, I will try to do that by focusing on computers and the internet. I won't argue that more bad than good has been done with these tools, for I don't think that could be determined, any more than a similar determination could be made for iron blades. The mind boggles at so infinite a calculation. But that's not the most serious problem with such a strategy. Merely trying to make that assessment would violate what I have already concluded, that tools in themselves have no value. Instead, I will argue something else, that computers and the internet are more than tools because they are causing changes in their users. They're making us worse people. To be clear, I don't think they have freedom, rationality, and agency, which would be necessary to act, properly speaking, and thus to make us worse with anything like deliberation and intention. Speaking more precisely then, I should say that we are making ourselves worse by using them. That's what I will now argue in 2 steps. First step, we are agents and machines are not. I won't have time today to give my full argument for this difference, which I have presented in more detail in my 2 previous debates before this very society, the first on free will last winter, the second on free speech 2 weeks ago. But here's a précis. We deliberate freely, make free choices based on our deliberations, and freely act out those choices in the ways we think and live. The evidence for this is the very event of a debate. We can engage in debate, machines cannot. By listening to the arguments made on both sides of a question, such as today's, and evaluating them for their soundness, you are freely deliberating about which side is better, with the idea that you might commit to believing it and act on that basis. That is intelligence. I don't presume that you are exercising it at this very moment. Maybe you are daydreaming, or maybe you are focusing on the speeches, but your mind is being swayed by rhetorical tricks, signals of social allegiance, or any number of other criteria not relevant to a rational assessment of this question. In fact, maybe no one, including me, is truly deliberating today. But if so, this is not a debate as I understand it. To be a debate, a dialectic in Plato's idiom, there must be some free evaluation of the alternatives in pursuit of truth. Machines, no matter how sophisticated, cannot do that. And there are some very sophisticated machines nowadays. The ones that actually exist are called artificial intelligence, or AI. These can accomplish some specific tasks better than we can. This was definitively demonstrated by AlphaGo, a program designed to learn and then play the Chinese game of Go by computing, I think, trillions of moves and their outcomes. Perhaps it's billions. In 2016, AlphaGo defeated Lee Sedol, the world champion Go player. Google has continued to develop this program, whose latest version learns the rules of the game on its own. By the way, I keep putting learns in scare quotes because I don't think machines can learn anything, properly speaking. That's because they don't understand anything. They never know anything. They can follow rules, and that makes them seem as if they learn, understand, and know, but they cannot grasp the meaning of the rules, which precludes them really learning. These claims would take us deep into epistemology and semantics. What is understanding, and why cannot machines achieve it? What is meaning, and why cannot machines grasp it? I'd be happy to discuss those in the question period, but here they would lead us too far afield into questions too technical. In any case, technological enthusiasts dream of such machines called artificial general intelligence, or AGI. This would be an intelligence like ours, that is, not programmed for a specific task, but able to tackle unspecified tasks, perhaps one day setting tasks for itself. That's the dream. But in both cases, real and imagined, these machines follow programs to achieve their goals. They cannot change their programs, or if they can, it is only because they have a second-order program for achieving, or rather for changing, their first-order programs. And that cannot be changed without beginning an infinite regress. In a word, machines are determined. As such, they lack the hallmark of intelligence. They cannot deliberate freely. You can. Technological enthusiasts who acknowledge this limit of machines nonetheless maintain that AGI is possible by denying that we can do anything more. In a word, they deny that we are free. In my conclusion, I will return to this denial and what it signifies about our cultural moment. I should also note that if you can deliberate freely, as I maintain you can, it is by no means obvious how you are able to do so. What must you and the world be like for this free deliberation to be possible? Those are deep questions with, I believe, a fascinating answer, but these are not our subjects today. Our subject is technology and whether it is bad. I am arguing that it is, focusing on computers and the internet. My argument has two steps, and I have now finished my précis of the first. You are a free, rational agent, machines are not. Now for the second step. Even though we are free and rational agents, capable of real deliberation, choice, and action, we can compromise our freedom and rationality, diminishing our agency. Our deepening engagement with artificial intelligence is having this effect. We are like lobsters in a pot. The temperature is rising and we barely notice. By the time the water is boiling, we will be too weak to jump out. This sort of trajectory is obvious in the case of certain addictive drugs. Heroin and alcohol are the best examples. They have ruined many individual lives. Consuming sufficient quantities of these drugs over sufficient time, the human mind gradually loses its ability to deliberate freely in pursuit of truth. Instead, it becomes like a machine, slave to a quite specific program. Get more of the drug. At times, such drugs have seemed to threaten the stability of whole societies. For example, China with opium in the 19th century, or England with gin in the 18th century. This is why there is always the temptation to ban them. Prohibition, the war on drugs, but that has proved to be a cure worse than the disease. And besides, the benefits of these drugs are so minor, pain relief and fleeting pleasure, while their baleful effects on addicts are so obvious to those who use them sparingly or not at all, that their abuse can never become universal. But this problem also occurs, though less evidently, with social media. Like alcohol or even heroin, it is possible to use social media sparingly, on occasion, for some benefit, to share photos with family members, to exchange articles with thoughtful people, or whatever. But like those drugs, there is something about social media, probably the powerful human need to be liked by others, that traps many people into an irresistible pattern of sharing and liking. In the case of drugs, the brain mechanisms of addiction are fairly well understood. In the case of social media, although the brain mechanisms that affect these patterns are less well understood, they are nonetheless used by tech companies to grab more and more of users' attention. That's the business model of social media, as Netflix's recent documentary, The Social Dilemma, shows dramatically. The tech companies gather data from your usage, then sell spots to advertisers by tailoring what you see to your data. This leads you to use more. And the more they get you to use, the more data they gather, making their tailoring more effective. The more effectively they tailor your use, the more money they make from the advertisers, and so on in a toxic loop of capitalist economics and evolutionary psychology. The goal of the tech companies, like that of a drug pusher, is to monopolize your time and attention. The reason it is so hard to limit your use of social media is that the tech companies are deploying artificial intelligence to perfect this loop. Remember, AlphaGo already defeated Lee Sedol in 2016, and Google has kept improving the program. If someone could not defeat an artificial intelligence in 2016 at a game for which he was the world champion, what are your chances in 2020 of defeating an artificial intelligence at a game you don't even know you are playing? Slim to none, and getting worse every year. Yet it's not a game. It's your life, your time and attention, your beliefs and desires, your contacts and communities, and ultimately your image of yourself. For even when you feel that you are in control of these, despite your use of social media, you have to wonder whether you are deceiving yourself. Your protests of independence and control sound a lot like those of the addict, who feels that she freely decides when to use her favorite substance, despite her use of it every night. Your phone's report of your average screen time does not lie. If you don't look at it regularly, how are you different from the drunk who never makes an accurate count of the wine bottles she drinks each week? Shouldn't you wonder, like the drunk who has lost years of her life to stupor, what else you might have done with those hours each day? Shouldn't you wonder, like the heroin addict who finds himself friendlier with other users than he is with his own family, why you care so much about the likes of total strangers? All you have to do is look around. People still sit next to each other, of course, but they stare less often into each other's eyes and more often into the black mirror of their phones. I use that phrase deliberately because I think the Netflix series of that name shows us a dark reflection of ourselves and what we are quickly becoming. It's why I use it in many of my courses nowadays, and why I made it the centerpiece of my podcast. Let me conclude with a thought about it. Many of the episodes of Black Mirror experiment with artificial intelligence. What would happen if ourselves were downloaded into a computer so that we could have another version of ourselves to be our slave, or so that another version of a criminal could be tortured to extract a confession, or so that multiple versions of a criminal might be sold to those who would enjoy torturing him, or so that another version of us could survive our bodily death in an apparent paradise, and so on. These are alluding to specific episodes. And each of them, each episode is valuable in its own right, raising all kinds of interesting philosophical questions. But what they all share is the fantasy that another version of ourself, and perhaps even our very self itself, might be established by a computer program. Black Mirror is not alone in exploring this fantasy. It's becoming a commonplace of popular entertainment. This fantasy works as entertainment, however, only when audiences find it plausible. And they'd find it plausible only if they felt that artificial intelligence is genuinely intelligent, that we are indistinguishable from computer programs, that our bodies are nothing but organic versions of machines. What this shows, I believe, is a massive failure of free rational agents, namely us, to recognize who we are. This failure has been caused, I think, by our encounter with computers in my lifetime, and it is only getting worse as the people who knew life before this revolution begin to die. Of all the Black Mirror episodes, the best on this particular point is Be Right Back. A husband dies in a car accident, ironically because he is addicted to his social media and crashes. In the desperation of her grief, his widow replaces him with a lifelike robot, which has assimilated all the data from his use of electronics while he lived, his texts, his voicemails, his social media posts. The illusion that this is him resurrected is so convincing at first that the widow has sex with him, although she is so ashamed of this that she hides the robot from her sister. But reality begins to assert itself when it is clear that it, and I'm here referring to the robot, which some people like to call him, that it has no free will. "Hit me," she screams at one point, hoping that the robot will fight back as she hits him, or it, if only to demonstrate his independence from the program that determines all of his behavior. He cannot. I find this episode hopeful. The limits of artificial intelligence will become clear as we foolishly put it into situations like this, where freedom, deliberation, and genuine action are required. In the meantime, though, I think we are making ourselves worse by confusing ourselves with our creations. This is one danger of free beings. We can make ourselves less free, less rational, less active by failing to own our own freedom and rationality. Addictive drugs are a helpful analogy. You can freely choose to drink to excess or to take opioids indefinitely. But the more you do, the longer you do this, the weaker your powers of deliberation become. There may even come a point in the addict's life from which there is no return. I doubt it, but either way, our freedom is so radical that we can choose to throw it away. This is happening, I have argued, in our deepening encounter with computers and the internet. If I am right, then, we are making ourselves worse. Allow me to summarize my argument. We use tools for good or bad. In themselves, they are neither. Artificial intelligence is simply a tool, and so it too is neutral. But it is neutral in the way of alcohol and heroin. Each can be used for good, but even then there are dangers that they will compromise our deliberation and make us more and more incapable of wise decisions. As I said earlier, the good of a drug used is relatively minor and short-term, pain relief or pleasure for the moment, while the effects of these compromises, mental illness or bodily death in the long term, are so severe and so obvious to those who use these drugs sparingly or not at all that they will never threaten whole societies. This is not so by contrast with artificial intelligence. First of all, the good it promises is major. With it, we are already gaining unprecedented power over nature, including that part of nature that is us. Exerting such power, it will, like addictive drugs, diminish our agency. But it is doing so most effectively in ways that are so subtle and widespread that we don't notice them at all. We are surrendering our own special power, reason, without ever recognizing that we were in a war against it. For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Dr. Lampert, do you have any response to?
I have hundreds of responses. I'll just say a couple of them, just to highlight the differences, and then you can all talk about it. I don't really think that all technologies are simply neutral. I think some technologies are good. I think the idea of transportation technologies, communication technologies generally are good. But of course, I agree they can be used badly, and they can be very harmful. But I don't think they're simply neutral. I do agree with the point that Patrick was saying about some of my suggestions about going to the moon and adding an eye. The part I agree with is that you can't really do one of those things in isolation. That if you go to the moon, to live on it, you're going to find a lot more things than if you just look at it in a telescope. But once you're living on it, then there's all kinds of other things you're going to need to do that you can't really predict yet. The same with sticking an eye in. It's going to have to be a whole body thing. But that's the good of it, is that these are changes that are kind of system-like rather than one-off things. It really is kind of makes you rethink the whole. So I think that's a good aspect of it. For the Go playing, I could talk about the Go playing at great length, so I'm not going to talk about that right now. The 2 points about AIs, I definitely think that AIs do not think. There was a time decades ago where people who were working on AIs thought they were going to try to imitate the way humans think, and then if computers could do that better, then we could say they were thinking, and if they were thinking better than us, they'd be, etc. The great minds that should rule the world. But it really didn't work. Getting computers to think in the human pattern was not making the computers very, very good. They could win at chess. Okay, that's easy. Chess is an easy game, but not at Go, not even close. So to play Go, they had to develop a completely different system based on Monte Carlo sampling. I don't know, some of you I think know something about that, but they worked in a way that nobody would think that's the way humans think. Nobody would call that thinking. And the people who make artificial intelligences now, I don't believe that they think of themselves as making thinking machines, although the vocabulary is still around a little bit in the popular press. They think they're making devices to solve statistical problems. And they solve statistical problems that are very useful for humans to know how to, not even to know how to solve, to know the solutions for, like um, like in medical diagnosis. We could talk more. Anyways, I don't think they're like machines. And I think that the fact that they're, sorry, I don't think they're like thinking, and the fact that they're not doesn't mean they're wrong technology. Like, we don't think that the car thinks, but we think it's very good technology, and the AI doesn't think, and it's a very good technology. So that's my thought about that. If we tried to be like computers, okay, that would be stupid. But I don't think anybody really tries to be like their computer when they run a program on their computer. I do appreciate the problem that we could get we could overuse the solutions that computers come up with, and we could get lazy in our thinking. I tried to indicate that earlier. Uh, and we could get so lazy that it'd be like addicted to being laziness, addicted to let the computer make decisions. And um, like, my first thought is, well, just don't do that. Don't do that then. And Patrick is pointing out that it's not so easy to say don't do that. Somebody who is addicted. I'm not sure if addiction is really the right model for this. I think it becomes sort of part of our lives. We make use of it a lot. Nobody would say just because you use your toaster oven 3 times a day that you're addicted to your toaster oven. But it is a wise thing for a person to know how to cook in other ways, not just use the microwave. So I'm just suggesting a person should be aware that the AI could take up too much of their solution building and just not do that. The people who make the technology would never do that. The people who make the technology would never get addicted to simply using it. And so that's why I suggest that in order to use it, learn how to make it work and learn how to make some, so that you're not just a user, you're a maker of it. And then I think the problem is more or less solved. Not solved, it's still a problem, but it's not an insoluble problem. And just in terms of the alternative, there was one point where Dr. Miller was saying uh, you look at the Facebook and therefore you neglect your own family. And I just want to suggest on this point, I'm not that pro-family. I don't think the natural family is really the goal. It's not the solution. If we're worried about what threatens our whole society, I would put family as a possible thing that threatens our society. At any rate, I'm not so I like my family, let me just say. I'm perfectly happy with my family, but I don't know that I would make family into a sort of generalized aspect of the good life. And so the alternative, computer versus or family, or people you know at a distance versus the people across the table, I'm not sure that I'm convinced by that. Anyways, that's a whole lot of points. I'm happy to stop there.
Can I just make a few quick replies? Because I think there were some misunderstandings of what I was saying. So I wasn't using family as a general principle. That was just an example. Choose whatever real relationship you think is valuable. And when people neglect the real relationship and instead, stare at their phone. I just see people out on dates, for example, and they paid to go to a fancy restaurant and they're each staring at their phones, and something's going wrong there. I agree that cars can't think, and that's no critique of them. So if that were my only critique of artificial intelligence, it wouldn't be a problem. My problem is that artificial intelligence can't think, and yet people are starting to understand us as just doing what artificial intelligence does. And I don't think it's true that enthusiasts for artificial intelligence and people who study human cognition have given up on modeling what we are and do on artificial intelligence. This notion of Bayesian epistemology is basically statistical reasoning, so that what knowledge is statistical reasoning, which already the computers, the artificial intelligence is doing much better than we are. And finally, my critique wasn't that the artificial intelligence makes us lazy and that we don't do stuff and it starts doing all the stuff for us. It was, again, just the point I've just come from making, which is that it does stuff so well that we start thinking that's what we do, and then we forget what it is that we actually do, which is understanding.
I guess, Dr. Lampert, if you want to say anything again, or if you would like to open it up.
I'd like to open it up, hear what other people say.
I have a question. Oh, go ahead, Tel.
Tell if you'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, go ahead. I can go after Tel.
Well, can you guys hear me?
A little, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Um, I think something that you've both, well, at least Dr. Miller has certainly alluded to, and Dr. Lambert has definitely danced around, is the concept of regulating technology. And I think it's a failure to regulate technology that leads us to the bads of technology and drives us away from the goods. But I'm not, I guess this could be my question. How feasible is it to truly regulate something like that? Because we've seen time and time again that it's virtually impossible to actually convince a population to regulate themselves once you've made something available to them. Once you put it in their hands, you can never take it away again. They'll do anything to get their hands on it. Prohibition's a great example of that. So if we can't regulate it, is it truly safe to make the technology available in the first place?
I'm happy to answer that, Jade, but you're welcome to go first if you want. Okay. Yeah, well, thanks for remembering that I mentioned prohibition and the war on drugs. I would say the same thing about technology, that the effort to regulate it is just going to backfire and make things worse. Just because something is bad doesn't mean it's the government's job to control it. So I'm not recommending political measures here, except perhaps some kind of reimagination of the relationship between capitalism and technology that I don't have, of the sort that's driving those perverse incentives of Silicon Valley. Aside from that, more specifically, what I am recommending is really spiritual practice, something that focuses on what it is that we can do, that is who we are, that is not accessible to artificial intelligence. So it's more about individual reclaiming of one's own self, and that's been alienated in these fantasies that we're just organic artificial intelligences.
Yeah, I actually probably agree with quite a bit of that. So I also think that there's no way that a new technology is going to be truly safe. Some good things are going to happen and some bad things are going to happen. I would like to see regulation when it comes to like creating new people just to torture them. I think we could regulate that. Maybe
Sure.
maybe there's some limits, but it is difficult to draw the line in advance because the whole point of the new technology is that it's an experiment. And if you make the experiments impossible, then you won't know what you need to regulate. But I kind of agree, it comes down to judgment. I just err on the side of encouraging the judgment where people would use these technologies and not be confused about what is the difference between themselves and the technology. If they want to put a piece of technology in and really think about it, don't think about it as one piece at a time. Don't think that you are the technology. So I think it is more and more up to individual practices to think to yourself, I need to decide this. I'm not just going to be the effect of the technology. I'm going to be the conscious user of it. So I think maybe we're kind of agreeing that it requires a spiritual practice or a thoughtful, reflective practice to manage it, and that regulation is only for the extreme worst cases.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you for the
So
question, Tom.
I was just going to ask, I guess this is more for, yeah, if you want to go after me, Alex, you can. This is more for Professor Lampert, I guess, because you said you think some technologies can be like good or bad depending on their things. So I just am curious as to what you guys have to say about like the invention of the Maxim machine gun, which was initially invented in mind by Henry Maxim to end all wars. He wanted it to be like, wow, this is going to be so good at killing and it's going to be awful and no one will want to fight a war anymore. And of course, like the essence of the machine gun is to kill other people. But the point behind it, of its creation, was to eventually bring about a good to stop it from happening entirely. Like, how can you make a judgment on the invention of the Maxim machine gun?
I think he sent it to you first.
Oh, okay, all right.
I'm fine with either of you answering. I'm just curious. It seems like an interesting thing to tackle.
Yeah. I didn't know that about it, but I'm not so impressed with the argument that it's so bad it's good. That that it kills so many people that because of that, it won't kill as many people. So I don't think the line of reasoning was very good there. Uh, I would say that's one of the bad kinds of technology, the kind that's just for killing. Even if the person who does it is kind of hoping maybe that'll stop the killing. It's like the Doomsday Machine and Doctor Strangelove. And so, anyways, if there's a bad technology, it's the killing kind or the torturing kind, in my view. And it's true that any given technology might have an unexpected consequence. It might have a good consequence if that was really what happened, although it wasn't. Um, Still, I'm going to call the technology bad if the whole purpose of it is killing and causing pain.
Okay. And then I like just in addition to that, there's like good technologies, like you said, like infrastructure, where like trains, they can be used to bring stuff around and stuff, but they can also be used to commit genocide of millions of people. Does that take away from the goodness of trains, or is that just yeah? I'll let you explain.
But it's definitely a problem that I have to admit. But that's the problem that anybody has to acknowledge when there's any use of technology, or even like a stick, a stick to get the apple out of the tree. Yeah, you could use that to hit somebody with. So it's kind of absolutely a given that anything you make could be used for bad or for good. That's true. I agree with Dr. Miller on that. But nevertheless, I think that the train has as its primary purpose and its usual function the good thing of that people can get to other places. And so I'm just going to call it good with some bad consequences. And I
Okay.
call the machine gun bad with some possibly a good consequence, possibly. But I think we should somewhat go by intended use. A train has a good intended use. It's not just neutral. The whole idea of it is a good one. And the same with uh, the machine gun in reverse.
Yeah, whereas I'm going to stick to my guns and say they're all neutral. I mean, take the train. Even if you focus on its intended use, it's the beginning of the internal combustion engine on a mass scale, and it's the beginning of the production of massive levels of carbon, which are poisoning the planet. So, I mean, they all have both good and bad consequences. And one of my strategies was to say, I have no idea how you would add up the good and the bad in order to make an assessment. So I just call neutral on all tools.
But just because it's difficult to add up the good and the bad doesn't mean that there's never something with more good than bad. Sometimes it's possible to judge that. Trains, like the idea is you're bringing things along a track, and pretty soon they're not going to be using fossil fuels. They're going to be using magnets or something. That's a problem that can be resolved while still in the train category. I don't think it's the case that just because you could use something for bad or it has some bad consequences, that just therefore the the purpose of it isn't good or the primary use isn't good. I think that's giving up too.
Yeah, that's just. I think it's just interesting because at least with the machine gun, like it was made to bring about good. Like his ideal was like no one would actually use it to kill each other. He's like, ah, that would be ridiculous. No one is gonna do that with it, but they did. So it feel yeah. I don't know. It's a strange medium to try to meet between having good intentions and then having it be deliberately used for bad, I guess as well. Because like also with like nuclear fission and stuff like that with the atomic bomb and as well as nuclear power.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I was going to
yeah.
ask sort of
Go ahead.
I was going to ask sort of a follow up to that and say if the idea of nuclear weapons is or changes the perspective towards this, because of course they essentially have ended warfare between the major nations for the past 75 years, or at least physical conflict. And I wonder if obviously that's more of a because it's such a large scale impact that warfare with that would have versus the machine gun, which only really is going to result in the death of human beings, versus nuclear weapons, which will possibly result in destruction of humanity. So I wonder if that and the actual effect that has had, at least for now, to seemingly end physical conflict between large nations with access to nuclear weapons, if that sort of changes the way you approach that question.
You just went muted right at the end. I didn't hear the final sentence.
Just if if thinking about that versus of machine gun changes the way either of you would answer that question.
Well, yeah, if nuclear weapons get used and destroy the entire species and the entire planet, then they turned out to be bad, I would say. But it hasn't happened yet. So in the meantime, I say I don't know how to make that assessment.
Yeah, that's one of the most difficult cases. I think it's a much harder case than a train or a machine gun, which fall more easily on one side to me. It's not that obvious that fewer people have died in wars since the bomb in Hiroshima. There's a lot of wars still in spite of that. So it didn't really have the effect of stopping wars. The whole Vietnam War was fought after that was possible. It's true they weren't killed all at once. I'm not sure that the evidence is in, because there's still a lot of atomic weapons out there, and it only takes one, and there's going to be around for 100 years or more. And so it's possible that when we have come to the end of the atomic weapon period, we'll find that no, there was 20 million people killed by it. So I don't know that we can really assess that yet. But again, a technology is not just one device. It is kind of comes from a system. So the understanding of relativity physics, or the understanding of atomic particles, or the understanding of eventually the quantum interactions, there's so many devices that come out of that technology that you could say, well, the iPhone is closely related to the same atomic physics that created the nuclear weapons, or the ability to have trains run on time because there's a universal clock, because there's satellites that we know how time bends relativistically, so the satellites can tell us what time it actually is, even though the light is made all that distance. So anyways, I'm not sure that you can really separate the nuclear weapon from all the other technologies that have come from atomic science. And I don't think you could think that not having had the theory of relativity, not having had particle physics, would have made the world a better place.
Alex, I believe you had a question.
Yeah, before the question, actually, Dr. Lampert said something great, and physics is an amazing example of this, because physics right now is kind of stuck. And the thing is, they have a lot of theorems which work great, but they don't actually have the technology to prove many of them. And so if we want to actually keep exploring, quote unquote, exploring space and understanding our universe, we actually need to develop more technology. And more often than not, we barely have an inkling of what that technology might look like. So in a way, the further advance of our sciences is predicated, especially of the empirical sciences, because physics is still quite empirical, on the advancement of technology. And until we actually kind of get there, we don't really know what technology will fulfill the needs that physics has, for example. Now, a lot of things that were talked about before remind me of a huge problem that is a focus of my thesis, which is friendly AI. So the general consensus is, if we want to get artificial general intelligence right, we only have one shot, and it has to be friendly from the start. I could actually go into a lot of problems, such as something we call the paperclip AI, which is why basically an AI that's not really thinking but following a set of instructions is an existential danger. There are papers and books about the assessment of global risks with technology and AI. But let me give you a practical example of something that's being done. So neural networks are a pretty amazing thing, and we don't get how they work quite. So if you give a problem to a computer with a neural network, it gives you an answer. It can even punt a response, meaning I do not have enough information to make this answer, which is already, an ethical problem for us, that we need computers that will tell you, I cannot make this decision. But what's really important is that, for example, in our automated theorem proving, humans are still necessary. So computers display amazing creativity, and they can do things that a human cannot. But they can also verify incredibly complex things that a human could not. So automated theorem proving is one of the best examples of how humans and computers need to work together, of things that a computer by itself cannot prove and a human by itself cannot prove. But on the friendly AI side, there's quite a few interesting projects. So there's this guy in Hong Kong called Ben Goertzel, he's an American, who created this robot/AI using neural networks called Sophia. And he is training it to be a humane AI. So Sophia does guided meditation. It does exercises in mindfulness. And I'm not kidding, it's actually pretty great, because they started off with a script in order to train it. They had it examine a lot of examples of what guided meditation looked like, the effects it had on people. And then it started kind of developing its own sessions. So it's not that the AI is more human, but rather that what Ben Goertzel is trying to do is getting the AI to understand these kind of very unique human things, because you cannot make the AI actually meditate, but you can make successful incursions into guided meditation. So anyways, the question kind of goes for both of you is, I actually probably more for Dr. Miller, because this is just one of the many examples that shows that, well, technology itself isn't bad. And actually there's a lot of things that we need technology for and that we can actually do to make technology better. The thing is, obviously, a point I've made in previous debates even, that these require a lot of technical knowledge, right? I, as a computer scientist who's studying to work on this kind of AI, can do it, but I couldn't expect a layperson to understand or to have the kind of temperance with technology, because they don't know what it fundamentally does. So yeah, I don't know. What do you think about those kind of things, Dr. Miller? Do they show that there's more nuance to technology than you might be suggesting?
Sorry, I'm hoping my dog will stop barking. There was a package delivered. Well, obviously I'm in a position.
I just had that happen too, but
Obviously I'm in a position where, because I'm not a computer scientist or an AI, I don't get into the nuts and bolts. I'm not able to say whether or not what I'm saying applies or not. In other words, it seems to me that it does, but that's not an answer that I could give. What I wanted to focus on in your question is that that AI or AGI that you're describing developed for mindfulness meditation.
It's not AGI yet. It cannot. AGI is a very specific definition, but it is a very advanced AI.
Yeah. Well, I argued that AGI is impossible, but people talk about it as if, they're going to get it, it's almost there, and so on. So, okay, this AI. And I don't know this particular instance, and you can correct me if this is not what happens, but what you said suggested that it's happening. That when it develops guided meditations, for example, what is it that makes it a good meditation teacher or whatever? The Turing test is what people mention. So the assessment of whether something is intelligent or not, whether it comes to the same level as an actual meditation teacher or not, is, can someone who can't see whether it's a computer or a human being, are they unable to distinguish the two? And this is now claimed for therapists, for example, that there are AI therapists who have a reservoir of answers based on statistical patterns of what in the long term helps people achieve relief from their symptoms. And it's like playing Go. It's, with a billion calculations of statistics, maybe this computer can say the right things in a circumstance to make that person feel better. Here's my basic problem, that the Turing test doesn't tell us whether it actually is understanding. It only tells us whether it's good enough to trick us into thinking it does. And when people put the Turing test forward as, this is the standard that we're going to use to find out whether we have an AI or not, that's one of the signs I take that people don't know what knowledge is anymore. They think that if you could trick someone into having knowledge, then you have knowledge. That's a fundamental epistemological confusion. And I think it's rooted in a fundamental confusion about who we are and what makes us who we are.
Okay, let me respond to that, Dr. Lampert, because it's very important. I actually fully agree with what you said. And there's a general consensus amongst AI analysts that the Turing test is not a good test because it is fundamentally anthropocentric. Now, the problem of it tricking us versus it actually knowing is Searle's Chinese room experiment. Do you know about it?
Yes.
Well, that's the fundamental problem. And now it can show two different things depending on how you read it. The simple explanation is that the use of language is kind of a misnomer for consciousness. But it's actually much more interesting when you think, well, consciousness is actually unfalsifiable, right? So when you get down to the kind of the nuts and bolts of AI, you realize that it doesn't actually matter. The Turing test puts it up to the standards of what we think is human. That's why it's the kind of, it can trick us. But actually that is not a good measure of what the AI does. We need to stop applying human standards to the AI, because I don't care if it's conscious or not. I don't care if it's AGI or not. Its existential paradigm is radically different from ours. Its capabilities are radically different from ours. That's why they exceed at certain games, at automated theorem proving, why they can do things like guided meditation. But we cannot pretend that they do it the same way that we do. In that sense, for now, they are just a tool. And if we get to AGI, and that's a really long debate, then again, it will not actually, like, you could have an AGI that cannot pass the Turing test. That's the whole point of, there was this great book in 2008 where the 4th chapter is basically a formalization of intelligence. And it kind of shows that problem, right? The problem is in those standards that are represented by the Turing test. I guess you're kind of comparing apples to oranges in a way with that analogy.
I was just going to say a couple of things. Like when you know how the AlphaGo, when you play Go against AlphaGo, you can see that it doesn't pass the Turing test. It's pretty straightforward. It just doesn't play like humans, and it doesn't play like humans, and you can't ask it, why did you play this move? It just doesn't really have any of the human things. So, but then again, I think that nobody would think that AlphaGo is a thinking, conscious thing. It plays Go in the sense that it comes up with moves that will defeat the human player of moves. And the same with, I imagine, the guided meditation machine. It guides your meditation. It doesn't mean that it's doing its own meditation while it does it. Right. It just does something that's helpful for your meditation. So anyways, that's kind of my first thought, is that it doesn't pass the Turing test. The Turing machines are universal. I mean, even Turing's Turing machine, a super simple thing that just counted, it's universal in the sense that it doesn't know that it's counting as opposed to doing some other thing. And so I think the universality of it is a bit of a red herring, because all Turing machines are universal. It's called the universal Turing machine. Anyways, the other thing I wanted to say about what Alejandro was saying is that I'm not sure that it's true that the first chance is all you get to make a good version of the technology. So I think Dr. Miller is right to say that in the case of the moon launch, a lot of that was done in order to win the Cold War. The motors were not very good. That's all they wanted to do. And yet, in spite of that, in 1961, when Kennedy gave that fantastic speech, do you all have that memorized? You'll say it in Kennedy's accent. We choose to go to the moon and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. That's so beautiful. That's the moon. That's the space travel principle, which is in principle overrides the low thinking motives of the first attempts. And right now, I can't imagine the United States going back into space travel in a serious way, because the American spirit is no longer can do. The American spirit now is, why should I? And so the United States is not going to do space travel. But Elon Musk, a crazy person, may find some way to make money out of it. And so I didn't want space travel to be like a capitalist thing where somebody's going to make money out of tourism or something, but I'm okay with it. Make it start that way, and then we'll see. I think that has to be like the feeling of first technology. Just get it going, and then we can see.
Although Alejandro,
So
wasn't your point about we only have one chance with AGI, that if we get it wrong, it's going to annihilate us by making too many paper clips?
Yeah, that's like one of the examples. There's, again, whole books and papers on the assessment of global risks. And it's not that realistically we will only get one chance. That depends on a lot of small factors, like what kind of intelligence takeoff we get, how it self-improves recursively, because that's kind of the definition of an AGI, that it can improve itself recursively. Again, there's a lot of factors. You could actually get what's called a multipolar takeoff, meaning there's several AIs going at once. It may be an arms race, it may not be. It also depends on the purpose of the AI. I don't know if you guys have heard of I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. It's a short story about basically an AI that was made for war and then kills people, and there's 4 human left, so it goes to torture it. Why? Because you made it for war, you trained it to kill, right? So that's a kind of thing. It's sure, we might get more than one chance, but statistically speaking, you really don't want to risk getting even that one chance wrong. It's kind of like with the nuclear weapons, right? Yeah, sure, we actually got more than one chance because they were used once when they had one country. Now, would you want to risk trying with another nuclear bomb and seeing if that doesn't start a world war, a nuclear war? It's that kind of risk assessment. And again, it's a very long.
Did anybody else have any questions? I wanted to ask something, and I don't know if it's going to form a cohesive question by the time I finish saying it, but something that Dr. Lampert, you mentioned, and that was certainly touched on by Dr. Miller and Alejandro, but you specifically mentioned that the people who, or you mentioned the importance of understanding the technology that we're inventing in our ability to use it effectively, and that the people who are inventing it are either not going to use it or they're going to use it effectively. They're going to know how to use it. But I wonder if the sort of trends in our society are suggesting that it's leaning more towards what Dr. Miller suggested, which is that the subsequent generations seem to be more likely to almost enslave themselves to it, to have their ability to reason and whatnot impaired by the use of this technology as the generations go on. So even if people like Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates or whoever, Elon Musk, restrict their children in some way from using the devices that they're creating, and that might be harming other people, the pool of people who have that ability to resist it and come at it from a disconnected way is slowly going to narrow as time goes on, especially as children who obviously lack the capabilities of discerning what is necessarily right and wrong for them gain more and more access to these tools. So I wonder, what is the sort of solution to that problem that emerges?
There's definitely problems there. I don't want to be simplistic about it. There's a lot of problems there. I think that insofar as it's technology, it's constantly changing. And so each tenth of a generation is going to have to redo the programming. And so in that sense, it's never going to be the case that grandpa made it and the rest, and now for a few more generations, we're just going to use it. There's going to be makers at it in every year. I do appreciate the problem that more and more people are just users and they're not making it. And so they don't know what it is and they can't make their own versions of it and they can't use it for their own creativity. That's probably always been true. Like anytime you talk about technology and science, you kind of have to think of the world in a rather elitist way, because it's rarely been the case that the majority of people knew what they were doing when they rode a horse or something. They did it because everybody else did. And so I think that it's never going to be the case that the technology just gets used because grandpa made it. Um, like there needs to be more education, more STEM education or something, or more fun education for children to know what the devices they're using are. And it's difficult to do. And one of the things that really makes me worried about human civilization is that so few people, adults, intelligent people, know even what special relativity is. Like I ask my classes, they're intelligent people. They've gone through high school, they're first, second, third year university. Who knows how special relativity works? Almost nobody. What the heck is going on with the world? It's 100 years old now, 115 years old, the theory of special relativity. It's what nature is. It's what matter is. And you got the majority of the world population look out to the world, they pick up pens, they think they know what a body is, they have no idea. Something's going wrong. It's true that technology is going faster and faster, but don't be so stupid. I want to say to people, know know a little bit about quantum physics. Yeah, so that's part of the spiritual exercise that people are going to have to do. Know a little bit more science than you've forced yourself to know so far. Isn't that right, Alejandro?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of my argument. I remember Dr. Miller kind of making a comment about, say, people on a date looking at their phone and even, using social media, not knowing about data mining and so on. And generally, my line of thinking is, how is this a new problem? And if you go back 100 years, how many people really knew about even Newtonian physics, right? How many people understood even the science of their time? My general argument is that we tend to think that people are becoming more stupid as technology gets smarter or things get more complicated. And I really don't think that's the case. There's always been a percentage of, let's say, stupid people. And it's just become more evident as the population grows larger and everyone has a microphone with social media. But yeah, in general, I agree with you. It's up to each individual to become literate and know what technology does. If you use social media, it's your fault. And I actually don't think mass data gathering is a bad thing. It's pretty useful. So yeah, that's kind of the way I go. Hey, if you want to have your data gathered, or if you don't know about it, you kind of have it coming. And we're actually, as a collective, going to benefit from that data, especially as people work on it. That I have studied quite a bit of data science, so it's really useful.
By spiritual practice, I didn't mean intellectual things like studying relativity or learning about data mining and so on. I meant giving especially children who are growing up in this environment where they've not known anything other, a constant experience of life off the grid. I mean, certainly off the grid of social media, but even off the grid of modern civilization, just so that they know what that is like and that they have something to compare this weird technological environment that we're in now with, so that they don't think of it as this is how we are.
I did think they're a little bit related. So my idea is don't just have kids look at the screen and push the same button over and over playing one of those games, but have them like open it up and try to make a game themselves. So it's a little bit connected to the idea of not just being a consumer.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably obvious from my speech, but I think the biggest problem is people who, and I'm guilty of this myself, the last thing that I look at before I fall asleep is my phone, and it's the first thing I look at when I wake up. And there's, Nietzsche anticipated this in the 19th century when he said that Europeans used to wake up and say prayers. Now they wake up and read the newspaper. It's a turning away from inner contemplation and spiritual life to just what is everybody else thinking, so that I can assimilate myself to that. And social media is just exaggerated.
My son looks at my phone and sees this. Some weeks my phone says your phone usage is up 30% this week. You're now using it 3 minutes a day.
Yeah. My speech was written as a critique of myself, not of you.
But I do wonder if the technology that is being invented now makes it harder for us to, I mean, I don't know if it would necessarily be comparable historically, but I wonder if the technology that we have now makes it harder to even have that ability to break away if you want to, because we talk about people having to make the wise decisions themselves and ultimately it comes down to them. But if you are using an addictive substance or an addictive device from childhood before you even have the ability to discern whether or not it's useful, I mean, it seems like it's borderline impossible to break away from it. I mean, I know certainly I didn't grow up with a smartphone, but I always had a computer. And we're sort of the last of the people who even didn't grow up with using the computer every day and whatever. So, and I find it impossible to break away, even as hard as I try. And so I wonder if the people who are growing up now and are being constantly fed it from childhood, I mean, you just have to hope that you have a parent who's conscious enough to raise you in a way that is healthy. But it seems like it makes it even harder than it's ever been to make those changes to your life if you so desire them.
Yeah, that's what I tried to argue.
Yeah.
So I actually
Yeah.
have, oh, sorry.
Oh. I was to say, yeah, it does actually seem that way because, like, even with me, like, someone who goes between Minnesota and Pennsylvania, it's really hard for me to unplug. Like, in addition to like a lot of my closest relationships also are online as well. So it's like even if I'm trying to isolate one bad thing from it, like I don't want to do this right now. If I get a Twitter notification, I can't help but read it. It's like
It's designed that way. If you haven't seen
yeah, I know.
I mean, they did it for that reason.
Yeah.
I think that of the bad kinds of technology, I would say Twitter is one of them. So I never had a Twitter account. I don't like it. But you know, but for the other things, the question of whether you can't pull yourself away from it really depends on first deciding was it good or bad. So there's lots of things you can't pull yourself away from, like your family. You could say, well, I tried to separate myself from my family a whole bunch of times. I just can't do it. But why should you do it if it's good? So the prior to the question, should you stop doing it? Or is it bad if you can't stop doing it? Prior to that is the question, is it good? And so I'm not saying that the computer use always is good. I'm just saying that's the prior question before the addiction question comes up.
Right.
And actually, something I've been going into for a long time is the issue of child abuse, and not even just outright abuse, but minor things that actually affect child development, like some forms of neglect, what's called the adverse childhood experience studies, and so on. And what's pretty interesting about this is I'm trying to decide whether or not to give a practical example, but let's start from now and go back in my history. It won't get too horrible. I've always used the computer for work, right? I cannot stand social media, partly because if I'm at the computer, if I'm with my phone, my brain goes work, and it's tiring. But the thing is, actually better than me. Think about my nephew, right? My nephew's like, the youngest one is 8. So his parents, who can't really put up with him, they just give him the tablet and let him do his thing, put some YouTube video, and that's since he was a kid. I actually agree with Dr. Miller that there needs to be some family foundation, but I don't think it's the technology's fault that you can just give a kid a tablet. Right? When I was a kid, hell, I haven't talked to most of my family members for 6-7 years now. That's a good thing. And when I lived with my parents, I would disconnect from them by reading a book. I would shut myself in somewhere, or I would leave and just read. And I think that's actually a very positive thing. Technology doesn't give you anything new, and escapes aren't always good, but you have to kind of balance that out between bad family environments, which are there regardless of technology, and what a good family environment can do. And in general, what I think is that a good family environment is happens regardless of the technology level, right? So I escaped with my books just as much as my nephew escapes with the damn tablet. I don't think one is better than the other. But Sorry.
Because experience when I come away from scrolling through Instagram for 2 hours or Twitter for 3 hours or whatever it is, and think, damn, I could have been reading a book. Because at the end of 3 hours of reading a book, you've got something, you've got some knowledge. Whereas scrolling through social media for a couple hours, it's like eating a whole bag of chips in one sitting. It just
right. But you and I read
horrible.
theory now, and maybe some really interesting, fiction books. I'm talking the kind of books a 9-year-old can read, and those aren't really,
Which are good
I
for
wouldn't.
9-year-olds.
Yeah, they're good for 9-year-olds, but for that same thing, so is a good enough YouTube video. We shouldn't just discard everything that's online either.
Yeah, no, I agree. My son has learned how to play piano from YouTube videos, so certainly a lot of value in it.
My nephew's doing that kind of thing too. He used to learn, not exactly piano. I don't remember what instrument he was learning. I think flute or something. But yeah.
I just then he was playing Candy Crush.
No, not always. They kind of started just showing him dumb YouTube videos, and then he started figuring out what he liked and going through those videos. Okay. So yeah, he's a smart kid. But anyways, my point is that a good family is good regardless of the technology level, and I do agree that there needs to be some disconnection. There does need to be, like we talked, I think it was last debate, right? Some kind of temperance and emotional teaching, and also intellectual nurturing. But most families aren't able to do that.
It's an economic problem often. They're just too damn busy trying to make a living.
Yeah, to me, it's more, again, I've studied a lot of child abuse, and you kind of recognize cycles of abuse, right? The clearest example is, oh, my father hit me and I turned out all right, so I should hit my kid. That's the most stupid example. But say, I was talking to my father 8 years ago saying, hey, why do you insist on having family dinners when we can't really stand each other and we're all kind of there with the TV anyways? And my dad said, well, when I was your age, we had the radio, and my grandfather told me that his father would just read the newspaper and his mother would do something else, but they would have family time, right? So the problem to me is more generational, and it's not that easy to solve, because if you look at the actual impact it has on things like brain development and on, I'm big on probabilistic realism, so kind of the statistical models you have of what a family or whatever should look like. These things are kind of intergenerational, and they go from intelligence, emotional education, and the kind of aggregate of personal histories. So that's why I'm kind of reluctant to accept that it's an issue that's just starting now or just about technology.
I'm sorry to say, but I'm going to need to leave soon for reasons of family, of all things.
Well, yeah, it's a good time to wrap up.
I agree. Thank you both to Dr. Miller and Dr. Lampert for coming here and doing this debate, and for everybody who did come out and ask questions. I'm glad that we managed to have a still lively discussion with everybody who came.
Yeah, you don't need big crowds for philosophy.
No, you don't.